In the last episode of Project Scirocco, I refreshed the tired, dirty rear axle beam on my 1985 VW Scirocco. I got it stripped down, powder coated, then replaced the old worn out rubber bushings with new polyurethane bushings. Finally, with fresh mounting hardware, I reassembled all the parts and ended up with a rear axle beam assembly that anyone would be proud of. In this episode, it's time to get the Scirocco's rear end put back together again.
Damn.
Shocks. Hey, so 2 episodes back we took the old shocks off, and now it's time to get the bump stop and the protective shield off. Those are reuse items, and I was having quite the trouble getting those off when I noticed that it's got that little indentation where the spacer goes as part of the shock assembly. Took the file to it and came right off. A little soapy water, a little elbow grease, and these things cleaned up pretty darn nice. Okay, when it came to replacement shocks, I didn't go crazy here. Just went with OEM Bilsteins. I believe they're Model B4, and they were on the order of $60 a piece. Nothing crazy. As you can see, it came with all the mounting hardware you needed, as well as a lower spring seat, which I promptly sent out to be powder coated along with the upper spring seat. And I couldn't leave the springs out. They got powder coated too.
Shocks.
Okay, with all fresh parts in hand, the first thing to go down is the lower spring seat, and followed by the bump stop and protective cover, and then there's a spacer that goes on the notch that's on the shaft of the shock. Make sure that when you put the spring on, you line up the spring itself with the lower seat. And after the spring's on, I put the spacer on.
What?
Followed by the upper spring seat. And again, you want to align the end of the spring into the notch on the upper spring seat. And then one person holds the shaft and one person can go ahead and tighten the upper nut. So, after thinking about it and going back and looking at the old video, the spacer does not go inside. The spacer goes on top of the spring seat. Maybe I should have consulted the service manual, which clearly shows that the spacer is on top of the upper spring retainer.
Fuck! The reason that bad things happen to you is because you're a dumbass.
Exactly.
Well, dumbass or not, here's what the shocks look like, correctly assembled. So this is the rubber line on the driver's side of the car, and as you can see, there's plenty of room to get in there and loosen it. Not so much on the passenger side. Fuel pump was in the way, and the bolt was stuck, so a little bit of penetrating oil was used.
A few moments later.
Great success.
Okay, so I needed to replace the rubber brake line that went in between the hard brake line coming off of the rear trailing arm and then the hard brake line going back up to the front main cylinder. And while I originally bought some replacement rubber flexible hoses,
rib for her pleasure. Ew.
in the end I decided to go with some stainless braided hoses, And these actually I got from New Speed. I don't have, unfortunately, any footage of me putting them on between the two, but I have to say that the braided ones were maybe 3/4 of an inch to an inch too long.
That's what she said.
So on the other side, and I've got some video of it, you actually get one of these loop-de-loop things going on to fit it in, and on this side I think we had like an S shape. So while it wasn't an ideal one-for-one fit, it actually did go on. So I've got steel braided brake lines in between the two hard lines in the rear, and this one is actually for the fronts. Alright, with the rear axle beam firmly attached to the car, it's time to put the shocks on. Again, I went with PowerFlex polyurethane bushings. One goes on the top of the shock and the other one goes inside the car. And the shocks are just as easy as putting the bolts into the axle beam and torquing them down to spec.
Now, let's do that. Oh, okay.
The next step was just simply to rotate the axle beam upward to get the top of the shock into the cavity so that we can put the nut on the inside of the car. Got a little bit of lube on the upper polyurethane bushing, got it into place, put the load spreader on and torqued the upper bolt on the shock down as far as it would go. Now it was clear that the shock strut didn't stick nearly as far out in the car as the one that we took off, and that's because we got new bushings in there and there was a lot of resistance. And with both nuts snug, we'll call it good for now. Once we get some weight on the suspension, we'll go back and see if we can tighten it anymore. There it is, guys. Back in one piece. Suspension, rear axle, brake lines, and new bushings on the shocks. Wow.
Nobody calls me dummy!
Alright, hey, so now that I've got the rear axle beam mounted up, it's time to get the new axle stubs on.
Dummy!
And this is one of the old ones that I took off. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's got some wear lines that are pretty pronounced. It's rusty, as you might expect. So got new hubs. Oh yeah. Yeah, you can see the rub lines on here and brand new hubs. So these are pretty easy to put on. They just go mount directly to the axle. The brake backing plate goes over it. You cannot put this on wrong because it's got two holes in the front that are spaced farther apart than the two holes in the bottom that match this pattern. So let's get to it. I believe these bolts go in at 44 foot-pounds. Okay, got the rear brakes put back on. Let's put the drum back on, get it sealed up, get the wheels on, and drop this thing off the jacks for the first time in a couple months. All right, so I'd like to say after many months of taking my time, working through all the issues, I think I finally got this Scirocco's rear end put back together. Nice! I learned a lot along the way, and it's not too hard if you just take your time. Next stop is to move forward and see if we can get this car started. As always, I really appreciate anybody that stops by to take a look at this project and see how it's going. I appreciate your views. If you feel so inclined, I'd appreciate if you'd leave me a like. If you want to encourage me to keep on going, maybe a subscribe would be great as well. And we'll see you in the next video.